A man stands on a train platform in Montana, 1886, holding a bunch of wilting wildflowers he never wanted to pick. He's waiting for a woman he's never met. A stranger he hired through a newspaper ad to care for his daughter, a little girl who hasn't spoken a single word in 4 years. But when that woman steps off the train, he doesn't see a housekeeper. He sees a bruised face, cracked ribs, and eyes full of fight. And something inside him. Something he buried after burning a village under army orders. Tears wide open. He drops the flowers. She tells him she doesn't need rescuing. And then, his silent daughter does something she hasn't done in 2 years. She walks up to this stranger and takes her hand. What happens next, across one brutal Montana winter, will test every lie they've told themselves about who they are, and force them to decide if two broken people can build something that doesn't break. Welcome to Cowboy Chronicles channel, where the Wild West isn't just dust and gunfire, but the place where the hardest battles are fought inside the human heart. If you love stories of frontier courage, impossible love, and the raw beauty of life on the open range, you're exactly where you belong. This story reminds us that being broken doesn't make you worthless. It makes you someone who survived. And sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do isn't pulling a trigger. It's choosing to stay. If this story hits you somewhere deep, drop a comment and tell me which moment gave you chills. Hit that like button so more people can find us. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a story from the frontier.
The last child Wyatt Holloway had seen bruised like that was in the village he burned. The memory hit him like a fist to the chest, sudden and merciless, right there on the platform at Copper Bend Station, with the October wind pulling at his hat and his daughter's small hand buried in the fur of the wolf dog beside her. He had not thought about the village in weeks. He had been doing better. And then the woman stepped off the train, and the past reached up from the grave where he had tried to bury it. Late October in Montana Territory meant the light came in sharp and thin, cutting edges on everything it touched. The Absaroka Range stood white-capped to the west. The first real snow already settled on the peaks like a warning of what was coming. Closer in, the holding pens by the rail depot were full of cattle lowing for water, and the smell of coal smoke and pine resin hung in the air the way it always did when the wind came off the mountains. Wyatt stood beside the wagon with a bunch of wild asters wilting in his left hand. Hank Mercer had made him pick them on the ride in. Said a man ought to bring flowers when meeting a woman for the first time, even if the arrangement was strictly business. Wyatt had argued. Hank had won. Hank always won the arguments that mattered. Nora sat on the wagon bench, 6 years old and silent as stone. She had not spoken a word in 4 years, not since the morning she watched her mother walk out the door and not come back. The doctors in town called it selective mutism. Wyatt called it his fault. The wolf dog Ghost lay across her lap, ears twitching at every sound. Yellow eyes watching the crowd with the quiet alertness of an animal that trusted nothing on 2 legs except the child he belonged to. Wyatt told himself this was a business arrangement. He had placed the advertisement 6 months ago in 3 newspapers, East and West. 14 women had responded. He had chosen Clara Byrne because her letter did not promise anything. No declarations of love, no claims of beauty or domestic perfection. Just plain facts laid out in a steady hand. I can cook, keep accounts, and manage a household. I'm not afraid of hard work or isolation. I need a new beginning. If you can offer honest employment in exchange, I will come. It read like a contract, not a love letter. That was why he chose it. A woman to care for Nora, nothing more. The train wheezed to a stop in a cloud of steam and cinder smoke. Doors opened. Passengers climbed down. Drummers and cattlemen and a preacher clutching a Bible to his chest like armor. And then her. She was small. That was the first thing he noticed. 5'3", maybe 4, with dark hair pinned up under a hat that had seen better days. She wore a gray dress that had been mended at the sleeves and hem, and she carried a single carpet bag that looked like it held everything she owned in the world, which he would later learn was exactly true. She stepped down from the car and nearly fell. Not from clumsiness, from pain. He saw it in the way she caught herself, one hand gripping the rail, her body folding around some hidden hurt in her midsection. Cracked ribs, he would learn later. 2 of them. Courtesy of her dead husband's brother, back in Boston. Then she turned toward the platform, and Wyatt saw her face. The bruise on her left cheekbone was fading from purple to a sick yellow green, the kind of color that meant it was a couple weeks old. Her lower lip was split and half-healed. Her left eye carried a faint swelling that makeup could not quite hide. She scanned the crowd looking for someone, and he knew she was looking for him. The asters dropped from his hand. He did not know he had let them go until they hit the wooden platform. All he knew was that something had cracked open inside his chest, some door he had nailed shut years ago, and behind it was a rage so cold and clean it burned. He had seen bruises like those before, on children, on women, in a village that no longer existed because of what men like him did when they followed orders they should have refused. Clara Burns spotted him then. She had been expecting an old man, he could tell, a grizzled widower with tobacco-stained teeth and a stoop. What she saw instead was a man of 32, 6'2", and lean, wearing clean but sun-faded clothes and a black Stetson pulled low. A Colt .45 on his hip in a holster worn smooth as glass from years of use. A burn scar running from wrist to elbow on his left forearm. And eyes the color of river ice, pale blue-gray, almost colorless, looking at her with an expression she could not read. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, walked toward him with the careful steadiness of a woman holding herself together by will alone. He met her halfway. For a moment they just stood there, 2 strangers on a wooden platform in the middle of Montana, the wind pulling at their clothes, the mountains watching like ancient witnesses. She opened her mouth to introduce herself. He spoke first. "You are coming with me." Not a question, not an offer, something else entirely. A declaration from a man who had just seen something that woke every instinct he thought was dead and buried with his marriage. Clara Burns straightened another inch. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes, which were brown and sharp and held more fight than any eyes he had ever seen, narrowed. "I do not need rescuing," she said. "I came here to work." That was the arrangement. Nobody said anything about rescuing. Ranch is 12 miles out. Sun is going down. "You want to walk?" She stared at him. He stared back. The wind blew between them, carrying the smell of sage and coming snow. Then something happened that neither of them expected. Nora climbed down from the wagon. The girl who had not willingly touched anyone except Hank and Wyatt in 2 years crossed the platform on her small boots, walked straight to Clara Byrne, and took her hand. No words, just her fingers wrapping around Clara's, holding on with the quiet desperation of a child who had been waiting for something without knowing what it was. The platform went still. Even the cattle seemed to quiet. Hank, who had been leaning against the wagon wheel, watching everything with the patience of a man who had outlived enough foolishness to recognize wisdom when it showed up uninvited, said softly, "She has not touched a stranger in years." Clara looked down at the small hand in hers, at the silent girl with storm-gray eyes, just like her father, at the wolf dog who had followed and now sat beside them both, his yellow gaze moving between Clara and Nora, as if deciding whether this new person was acceptable. Something locked into place behind Clara's ribs. Something deeper than logic or self-preservation, or the voice in her head that had been screaming "run" since the moment she stepped off that train. She could not walk away from this child. The ride to Broken Ridge took the better part of an hour. Hank drove the wagon. Wyatt sat beside him. Clara and Nora sat in the back with the supplies and Ghost, and Nora did not let go of Clara's hand for a single mile of it. The land unrolled around them like something out of a dream Clara had never dared to have. Golden grass stretching to foothills that climbed into mountains. A herd of elk crossing the trail ahead, unhurried, their breath steaming in the cooling air. The creak of the wagon and the soft clop of horse hooves on packed dirt. The smell of pine and cold water from the creek they forded, the water running clear over stones that glinted in the last of the daylight. This was not Boston. This was not the cramped apartment above the butcher shop where she had spent 3 years learning the geography of fear, mapping which floorboards creaked and which doors locked, and where to hide when Garrett Byrne came home with whiskey on his breath and violence in his hands. This was something vast and indifferent and terrifyingly open. Montana did not care about her. Montana did not care about anyone. And somehow that was the most comforting thing she had felt in years. As they crested a ridge, Clara saw the valley below. To the left, a modest ranch with a log house and a barn and a corral where horses stood nose to tail against the wind. Broken Ridge. To the right, separated by a creek that caught the last light like a ribbon of copper, a massive stone house with outbuildings and dozens of hands at work. A ranch 3 times the size of Wyatt's, rich and sprawling, its stone walls glowing amber in the sunset. "What is that place?" Clara asked. "Thornwood," Hank said. "Belongs to Eli Thorne." Wyatt said nothing. But Clara saw his jaw tighten, saw his hand drift to the butt of the Colt on his hip, the way a man touches a scar without thinking. Whatever lay between Wyatt Holloway and the owner of that stone house was not finished. As the wagon rolled down toward Broken Ridge, Clara glanced back at Thornwood one last time. The last light was fading from the upper windows, and for just a moment she thought she saw something on the second-floor balcony. A figure. A woman, standing very still, watching the wagon pass. Then the figure stepped back into the darkness, and the curtain fell closed, and Clara told herself she had imagined it. She had not imagined it. There were no mirrors in the house. It took Clara 2 days to notice, and when she did, she understood more about Wyatt Holloway than any letter had ever told her. The cabin was 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a front room. Clean but hollow, like a body with the soul scooped out. The furniture was handmade and sturdy. Wyatt had built it himself, but there was nothing decorative anywhere. No photographs on the mantel, no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the rough plank floors, no flowers in jars. No color at all except the gray of weathered wood and the black of the cast iron stove. It was the house of a man who had systematically removed every soft thing, every beautiful thing, every reminder that life could be something other than work and silence and the long passage of days. Nora's room was the exception. Its walls were covered in drawings, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pinned and tacked and pasted over every surface. All of them showed the same subject. A woman seen from behind, walking away. In some, the woman was small as a doll. In others, she filled the whole page. Some were drawn in pencil, some in charcoal, one in berry juice that had stained the wall beneath it a faded purple. The woman never had a face. She was always leaving. Clara's room was off the kitchen with its own door to the outside, exactly as the letters had promised. A narrow bed, a dresser with a cracked drawer, a straight-backed chair, a window that faced the barn. Wyatt stood in the doorway and laid out the terms like a man reading a bill of sale. "You are here for Nora. You cook, you teach her, you keep house. I pay $3 a week. This is a work arrangement, not a marriage. We live under the same roof, but I will not touch you. Ever." Clara looked at him, this tall, scarred man who could not meet her eyes when he spoke about boundaries, but who had crossed a platform in 3 strides when he saw her bruises. "Good," she said, "because if you touch me, I will cut your throat while you sleep." The ghost of a smile crossed Wyatt's face, the first one she had seen. It was gone almost before it existed, but it changed the shape of his features entirely. And for one unguarded moment, Clara saw what he must have looked like before grief carved him hollow. "Fair enough," he said. That first supper she cooked with 2 cracked ribs screaming under her corset, working one-handed where she could, bracing against the counter when the pain spiked so hard her vision went white at the edges. Beef stew from salt pork and dried beans. Cornbread from the last of the cornmeal. coffee strong enough to strip paint off a wagon. They ate in near silence. Nora ate hungrily. Wyatt ate fast, the way a man did when he was used to eating alone, as if the food might be taken from him. Outside, the wolves howled. The wind keened through every gap in the doorframe. Cattle settled in the corral with low, mournful sounds. Clara realized something that first night. Out here in Montana Territory, 12 miles from the nearest town, darkness was absolute. No street lamps, no city glow, no neighbors close enough to hear you scream. Just the black and whatever lived in it. A woman fresh from 3 years of terror might have found that frightening. Clara found it peaceful. Because for the first time in longer than she could remember, the thing she feared was not inside the house with her. After supper, Wyatt went to the barn. Clara could see the lamplight through the kitchen window, could hear the low murmur of his voice as he talked to Hank. She did not know that Hank was saying, "She has been beaten." Not once. Many times over years. She did not know that Wyatt answered, "I know." She did not know that Hank said, "Same as those children in the village," and that Wyatt said, "Don't," in a voice that could have frozen the creek solid. She did not know that Hank said, "You hired her for Nora, but you are keeping her because you see yourself in her," and that Wyatt said nothing at all because there was nothing to say to truth that naked. What she did know was that when she checked her door before bed, she found the lock had been oiled. Recently. And when she turned it, it slid home smooth and solid, a bolt that could hold against anything short of a battering ram. He had not locked her in. He had made sure she could lock herself safe. That small act of consideration, so quiet and so deliberate, unsettled her more than violence ever had. She understood violence. She had a map for it, a system of signs and responses built over years of survival. But kindness without expectation was a foreign country, and she did not know the language. She slept that night with the derringer under her pillow, and the door bolted, and the sound of wind and wolves and cattle for her lullaby. Past midnight she woke to screaming. Not hers, his. Wyatt was having a nightmare. She could hear it through the wall, the guttural shouts that were not quite English, the crash of something knocked from a table, the awful sound of a grown man fighting ghosts that only he could see. Clara stood outside his door with her hand on the knob. She could feel the wood vibrating with the force of whatever was happening on the other side. Every instinct said, "Open it. Help him. Do something." She did not open it, because she understood in her bones that some doors should not be opened unless you are invited, and that a man who wakes from nightmares to find a strange woman standing over his bed might react in ways that would be nobody's fault and everybody's tragedy. She went back to her room. She did not sleep again. In the morning, before Wyatt stirred, she set a cup of coffee outside his door. Black. No sugar. The way he had drunk it at supper. She did not knock, did not explain. Just left it there, and went to start breakfast. When she came back later, the cup was empty. Neither of them mentioned it, but the next morning there was a cup waiting outside her door too. And neither of them mentioned that either. On the second morning, Clara walked to the well at dawn. The air was sharp and cold and tasted like iron. Frost glittered on the fence rails. The mountains stood enormous against a sky the color of new steel. Nailed to the fence post, flapping in the wind, was a letter. Red ink on rough brown paper. No signature. No return address. You do not belong here. Leave before it is too late. Clara pulled it free. Read it twice. Looked around at the empty grassland, the distant mountains, the barn where Hank was already moving, the house where Wyatt's door was still closed. Nobody. But the letter knew things. It mentioned the missing mirrors. He took the mirrors down so he would not have to see what he has become. You should take the hint. Only someone who knew this house, who had lived in it, would know about the mirrors. Clara's mind went immediately to one name, Amelia, Wyatt's wife who had left, writing from wherever she was now, warning the new woman away. It was a reasonable assumption, and it was wrong. Clara folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. She did not tell Wyatt. That was her first secret. It would not be her last. 600 acres sounds like a fortune until you have to ride every one of them in freezing rain, looking for 20 lost cattle with 3 wolves trailing your horse, and the temperature dropping so fast you can watch the ice form on the creek in real time. Wyatt Holloway rode out that Sunday morning before first light, leaving Clara and Nora in the cabin with the fire banked and coffee warming on the stove. He rode his gray gelding Jack, a horse with more sense than most men and a temper to match, and he rode with Hank Mercer on his left and 2 hired hands behind. Tomas Guerrero was 28, a Mexican vaquero who could rope a steer at 40 paces and who smiled so often it seemed like a condition he could not cure. Red Horse was Crow Nation, somewhere in his 40s, with a face like weathered stone and eyes that read the land the way a preacher reads scripture. Red Horse had been reading the land all autumn, and what it was telling him made the hairs stand up on the back of his neck. "Winter is coming early," Red Horse said that morning, studying a sky that was the color of a bruise. "Bad winter. The wolves are coming down out of the high country already. Geese flying low. Ground freezing ahead of schedule. The land is afraid. They were bringing cattle down from the summer pasture in the high meadows, pushing them into the sheltered draws closer to the ranch where they could be fed and watered when the deep cold came. It was brutal, necessary work. The kind of work that made or broke a ranch. Wyatt, in this element, was a different man entirely. Gone was the awkward silence of the kitchen, the careful avoidance of eye contact, the stiffness that came from living too long inside his own walls. On horseback, working cattle, reading the land, he was fluid and sure. He rode like the cavalryman he had been, his body one piece with the horse, the reins light in his scarred hands. He saw a calf tangled in deadfall and was off his horse and freeing it before the others had registered the problem. He spotted wolf tracks on a ridgeline and changed the whole drive pattern without raising his voice. He fixed fence line that a grizzly had torn apart, hauling wire with bare hands in the cold until his fingers bled. "This is who he is," Hank told Clara later when the subject came up. "That man out there on the range, that is the real Wyatt Holloway. The one in the house is just the ghost he sends inside when the work is done." While Wyatt was on the range, Clara was in the cabin with Nora, and a discovery was about to change the shape of everything she thought she knew. It started with drawing. Clara had been trying to reach Nora for days, and on this Sunday morning with the cabin to themselves, she tried something new. She sat down at the kitchen table across from the girl, picked up a piece of charcoal, and drew a cat. It was a terrible cat, lopsided ears, a tail that looked more like a snake, whiskers going in directions that defied the laws of nature. Clara held it up with exaggerated pride and said, "What do you think?" Nora stared at the drawing. Her gray eyes, so like her father's, widened, her lips pressed together. And then, for the first time since Clara had arrived at Broken Ridge, the child laughed. It was barely a sound, more breath than voice, a tiny huff of air that carried the ghost of joy. But it was real, and it cracked something open in Clara's chest that she had thought was sealed forever. She turned away fast so Nora would not see the tears. When she turned back, the girl was already drawing her own version of the cat, and this one was beautiful, full of life and motion, and the kind of detail that only came from truly seeing the world. Clara realized something in that moment. Nora's drawings were not random childhood scribbling. They were a language. The woman walking away was mother. The wolf dog was safety. The dark scribbles that filled some pages were fear. The empty white spaces were silence itself. Nora had not lost her voice. She had chosen a different one. They drew together for an hour side by side at the table, and Clara told Nora about a cat she had known in Boston, an orange Tom named Sargent who lived in the alley behind the butcher shop, and who had been the only creature in that neighborhood who did not flinch when Clara walked by with bruises on her face. "Animals do not judge," Clara said. "They just see what is real." Nora nodded as if she understood this better than any adult ever could. Later, while Nora was drawing in her room, Clara cleaned. She swept and scrubbed and organized. the kind of physical work that kept her mind from circling back to the things it did not want to examine. In the front room, prying up a loose floorboard to kill a draft, she found a locked box. Heavy, iron, old. She did not open it. That was not hers to touch. She noted its location and moved on. In the barn, fetching eggs from the henhouse, she found something else. Hidden in the back of an old feed trunk under burlap sacking and a rusted horseshoe was a dress. A woman's dress, calico cotton, the kind a ranch wife would wear for everyday work. The fabric was stiff, dark, crusted with something that had dried long ago. Blood. A lot of it. Clara's hands went cold. Her breath stopped. The egg she was holding slipped from her fingers and broke on the barn floor. Her mind, trained by 3 years of survival to calculate threat in an instant, laid out the possibilities with horrific clarity. Amelia Holloway had not left. Amelia Holloway was dead. And the man Clara was living with, the man who had looked at her bruises with something like recognition, had put her in the ground somewhere on these 600 acres. She thought about the Derringer in her apron pocket, the little 2-shot pistol Wyatt had left outside her door as a gift. Had he given it to her because he wanted her to feel safe? Or because he knew that eventually she would find the dress and he wanted her to have a fighting chance? Clara left the barn on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. She went back to the cabin. She sat at the kitchen table across from Nora, who was drawing the cat again, and she said nothing. But inside her chest, the fragile thing that had been growing since Nora took her hand on the platform was now wrapped in barbed wire. Could she trust a man who might be a murderer? That afternoon, Doc Josephine Ridley arrived for Nora's monthly checkup. Jo Ridley was 45 years old, one of the few female physicians in Montana Territory, and she carried herself with the blunt authority of a woman who had spent 2 decades refusing to be small. She drank rye whiskey. She rolled her own cigarettes. She wore men's boots under her skirt and kept a Bowie knife in her medical bag beside the stethoscope. She examined Nora first. Same as always. The child was physically healthy. The silence remained. Then Jo turned to Clara. "May I?" It was not really a question. Behind the closed door of Clara's room, Jo examined her ribs with hands that were rough and precise and surprisingly gentle. Her face darkened with every inch of skin she uncovered. "Who did this to you?" Jo said. "Husband?" "My husband is dead." "Good. But these ribs are not healed. You have been cooking, hauling water, splitting kindling with 2 cracked ribs. Are you crazy, or have you just been in pain so long you have forgotten what not hurting feels like?" The question landed like a slap. Clara had no answer, because the truth was that Jo was right. She had lived in pain for so long that pain had become the baseline, the normal state of being, and anything else was the anomaly. Jo went outside and found Wyatt. Clara heard their voices through the wall, could not make out words, but she heard the change in tone. Jo's voice, flat and factual. Then Wyatt's, quiet at first, growing tight. And finally a silence that had texture. The silence of a man holding down something that wanted to explode. That evening, after supper, after Nora was in bed and the cabin was still except for the pop of the fire and the distant keening of wind, Clara found something outside her door. A jar of pain salve, rib bandages, clean and folded, and a note in a hand that was careful and slow, the hand of a man who wrote rarely and chose his words with effort. "For what it is worth, nobody is going to hurt you here. But if they try, you do not have to wait for me." Clara sat on her bed and held the note against her chest and cried. Not from the pain in her ribs, which was constant and familiar and almost a companion by now. She cried because she did not understand how a man who might have killed his wife could also be the kind of man who oiled a lock so a stranger could feel safe, who left medicine outside a door without expecting thanks, who wrote a note that said, "You do not have to wait for me," meaning you are allowed to save yourself, meaning I know you are strong enough, meaning your survival does not depend on me. She had never met a man who wanted her to be strong. Garrett had wanted her weak. The weaker she was, the more he controlled, and the more he controlled, the safer he felt. That was the arithmetic of abuse. That was the ledger that never balanced. But Wyatt Holloway had given her a gun. Clara wiped her eyes, put the bandages on her ribs, applied the salve, and lay awake thinking about a bloody dress in a barn, and a note that smelled like pine and leather, and something she was afraid to name. The next morning was Sunday again. Eli Thorne came visiting. He rode up to Broken Ridge on a handsome bay mare, dressed finer than any man had a right to be at that hour. Silk vest, beaver felt hat, boots polished to a shine that had no business being seen on a working ranch. He brought gifts, a basket of apples from his orchard, a bottle of French wine, a tin of tea from back east. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had been raised with money and had made more of it since. Clara watched him from the kitchen window and felt her skin go cold. He was charming. That was the problem. Charming in the practiced, effortless way of a man who had studied the art of making people trust him. He tipped his hat. He said, "Ma'am." He complimented the smell of Clara's cooking with a smile that showed even white teeth. Clara recognized him instantly. Not the man himself, but the type, the surface warmth, the careful courtesy, the way his eyes took inventory of everything while his mouth said nothing but pleasant things. Garrett Byrne had been exactly this kind of man, handsome and gracious in public, a butcher behind closed doors. But Clara also doubted herself. Was she being fair? Was every charming man a monster? Was she so broken by Garrett that she could not tell the difference between genuine kindness and its counterfeit? Eli mentioned Amelia, just in passing, the way a knife slides between ribs. "Hope this one stays longer than the last Mrs. Holloway." He said it smiling. His eyes flicked to the land as he said it. The creek boundary, the north pasture, the timber line. He was not looking at Clara. He was surveying property. Wyatt came in from the barn and found Eli on his porch. The change in Wyatt was immediate and total. His body went rigid, not fear, readiness, the stance of a soldier who has identified a threat and is calculating distance and angle. The exchange was short and edged. "Just welcoming your new arrival," Eli said. "Fine woman, Holloway. You always did have taste when you bothered to try." "Get off my land, Eli." Eli smiled, tipped his hat to Clara. "Pleasure, Mrs. Byrne. My door is always open if you need anything. Anything at all." He said the last two words looking at Wyatt, not at Clara. Then he mounted his horse and rode back toward Thornwood at an easy trot, taking his time about it, the way a man does when he wants you to know he is not afraid of you. After he was gone, Clara asked, "What is between you two?" Wyatt's face was closed, locked. The mirrors in the house were not the only things he had stripped bare. "Eli Thorne wants to buy this ranch. I will not sell." That is the whole story. Clara knew it was not, but she did not push because she was keeping secrets too, and a woman hiding a bloody dress and an anonymous letter had no right to demand transparency from anyone. That evening, late, after the house was dark and Nora was long asleep, and Wyatt had gone to the barn to check on a horse with a swollen fetlock, Clara lit a lamp and sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the anonymous letter again. He took the mirrors down so he would not have to see what he has become. Whoever wrote this had lived in this house, had known it intimately, had known about the mirrors. Amelia. But Amelia had left. Everyone said so. Wyatt said so. The whole town said so. Clara put the letter away, blew out the lamp, and lay in the dark listening to the wind and the wolves and the sound of Wyatt's boots on the barn floor. And she wondered if the woman who had lived in this house before her had left it walking or carried. The wagon axle snapped like a rifle shot. One moment they were rolling through a creek crossing 5 miles from the ranch, the wheels crunching over river rock, Nora dozing against Clara's shoulder in the back. The next moment there was a crack loud enough to scatter the horses, the right side of the wagon dropped like a stone, and supplies went flying into the icy water. Clara grabbed Nora and pulled her clear as the wagon tilted. Wyatt was off the bench and in the creek in an instant, water up to his thighs, steadying the horses before they could bolt. Ghost scrambled to the bank and stood barking at the broken wagon as if insulting it. They had been in Copper Bend buying supplies. It was the first time Clara had been to town since arriving, and it had been an education. Copper Bend was one main street, a saloon called the Antler, a general store run by Ruth and Samuel Pratt, a post office, a blacksmith, a church, and a sheriff's office. Everything you needed to survive and nothing you wanted for pleasure, horses tied to every rail, the smell of tanned leather and tobacco smoke. Men in range clothes and women in calico, all of them watching Clara with the open curiosity of people who lived in a town small enough that a new face was genuine news. At the general store, Clara had overheard two ranchers' wives whispering behind the flower display. Poor thing. Came all the way from Boston with a beaten face. Holloway hired her because no one else will live on that place. Not since Amelia. They stopped when they saw Clara listening. The name Amelia caused a reaction in everyone who heard it. Not surprise. Something else. Something that looked like guilt wrapped in silence. At the post office, Clara had asked the postmistress, Mrs. Doyle, whether any mail had come for Wyatt lately. Mrs. Doyle was a talker. The question opened a gate. Not for months, she said, sorting letters with practiced speed. Used to get them regular, though, from his wife, you know. After she left. Never opened a one. I know because they came back returned to sender every time, all of them. Broke my heart. Clara filed this information away with the care of a woman who had learned to build cases out of small facts. If Amelia's letters were returned, then Amelia knew Wyatt would not read them. So why would Amelia bother writing anonymous threats to the new woman? Why go to the trouble of red ink and secret delivery when her own letters came back unopened? The logic did not hold. Now they were stuck in a creek bed at dusk with a broken axle, a sleeping child, and 5 miles of Montana wilderness between them and home. Wyatt assessed the damage with the quick efficiency of a man who had fixed things his whole life and had long ago accepted that the world would keep breaking them. Axel is done. We are not fixing this tonight. Hank can bring a team in the morning. 5 miles in this cold with a child, Clara said. Done it before. Montana does not care if you are tired. He lifted Nora, who barely stirred, and settled her on his back. The girl's arms went around his neck and her head dropped to his shoulder, with the boneless trust of a child who knew without question that her father would carry her anywhere. Ghost fell in beside them, and they walked. The trail was hard, packed dirt that turned to mud where the frost had thawed, and then to frozen ruts where it had not. The light bled out of the sky fast, the way it did in October, going from gold to copper to violet to black in the span of a mile. Stars appeared, not the distant apologetic stars of a city sky, but the hard, brilliant, merciless stars of open country, so many and so bright they threw faint shadows on the ground. Wolves howled in the timber to the north, not close, not far. They walked in silence for the first mile. Wyatt's stride was long and steady, his breath even, despite the weight of the child on his back. Clara kept pace beside him, her ribs aching with every step, the cold seeping through her coat and dress and into her bones. In the darkness, with the stars wheeling overhead and the wolves calling, and no one to see or judge, the rules changed. The careful distance they had maintained in the cabin, the polite avoidance, the agreement to share a roof but not a life, all of it felt paper thin out here in the open. Clara heard herself speak before she decided to. I found something in the barn, a dress, with blood on it. Wyatt did not break stride, but his shoulders shifted under Nora's weight, and the silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat. That was Amelia's, he said finally. I need to know. Did you? She could not finish. But he understood. Did I kill her? Is that what you are asking me? Yes. Another silence. Longer this time. The wolves stopped howling as if even they were listening. No, Wyatt said. Amelia fell from a horse 2 days before she left, gashed her leg bad enough to need stitching. Doc Joe patched her up. The dress was ruined. I kept it because I do not know why I kept it. Same reason I keep the letters I do not open, because throwing things away feels too much like admitting she's really gone. She is really gone, though. Yeah, she is. They walked another half-mile before Wyatt spoke again. You thought I killed her, but you still walked 5 miles beside me in the dark. I had the Derringer, Clara said. That little thing would not stop a determined raccoon. It would slow one down. The laugh that escaped Wyatt Holloway was so unexpected and so small that Clara almost missed it. A huff of air, a crack in the wall. It lasted less than a second, but it was the first real laughter she had heard from him, and it changed the temperature of the air between them more than any fire could have. They reached Broken Ridge near midnight. The cabin was cold, but the embers were alive. Clara built the fire while Wyatt put Nora to bed, and then they stood in the front room, warming their hands, not looking at each other, not speaking, both of them aware that something had shifted in the miles between the creek and home. You asked me a hard question out there, Wyatt said. You deserve the same chance. Ask me anything. Clara looked at the fire, at her hands, at the scars on his forearm visible where he had pushed up his sleeve. The nightmares, she said. What are they about? Wyatt was quiet for a long time. Then he sat down in the chair by the fire and told her, in fragments, about the army, about a winter campaign, about an order to burn a village, about what he saw inside when the fire took hold. He did not tell her everything. Some things lived in the place beyond language. But he told her enough that she understood the screaming in the night, the missing mirrors, the guilt that lived in him like a second skeleton. I do not want to see my own face, he said. That is why the mirrors are gone. Clara sat across from him and told him about Garrett, about the first time he hit her 3 weeks after the wedding because the roast was dry, about the slow, methodical isolation, the friends who stopped visiting, the family who stopped writing, the world shrinking until it was just the two of them in that apartment, and she was so alone that she sometimes forgot other people existed. She told him about the night she stood over Garrett's bed with a kitchen knife while he snored. 3 a.m, his mouth open, whiskey breath filling the room. She held the knife for 11 minutes. She knew because she counted the ticks of the clock on the mantel. She put it down, not because of morality, because she was afraid of failing. If she tried and missed, if he woke up and caught her, the beating would be the last thing she ever experienced. She was not brave enough to risk it. That was the truth she had never told anyone. You are not a bad person for thinking about it, Wyatt said, and you are not a monster for following an order. I am not sure about that. Monsters do not rescue orphaned wolf dogs. Monsters do not carry their daughter 5 miles through the dark. Monsters do not leave a gun outside a stranger's door so she can feel safe. The fire popped and settled. Outside, the wind had died. The night was very still. Clara, Wyatt said. It was the first time he had used her given name, not Miss Byrne. Clara. Who has been writing to you? She froze. I found the first one on the fence before you arrived, he said. There was one before that, too. It said, do not bring another woman here. I should have told you. I thought they would stop. Clara reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the latest letter, the one she had found that morning, slipped under the front door of the cabin while they all slept. Someone had walked onto the porch in the dark, inches from where she lay behind a bolted door, and left it. Ask him about Amelia. Ask him where she really went. The answer is closer than you think. She handed it to Wyatt. He studied it in the firelight, and she watched his face change when he saw the paper. Not the words. The paper itself. Thick, cream-colored, with a small embossed letter in the corner. The letter T. It was Thornwood stationery. Clara had recognized it from the label on the wine bottle Eli had brought as a gift. Eli, Wyatt said. Clara shook her head. Or someone Eli is keeping at Thornwood, someone who knows this house well enough to mention the mirrors. The name Amelia hung between them like smoke. Neither spoke it. Neither had to. "I want you to stay," Wyatt said. "Whatever this is, whoever is writing these, I want you to stay." The sentence carried more weight than any declaration of love Clara had ever heard. It was not poetry. It was not romance. It was a man who had stripped his house of every beautiful thing, admitting that something beautiful had walked back in, and he was not ready to let it go. She did not answer with words. She poured him a cup of coffee. She poured one for herself. They sat by the fire and drank in silence, and the silence was, for the first time, not heavy. It was comfortable. It was the silence of two people who had told each other the worst, and found that the worst was survivable. The first snow fell on the 2nd of November, and did not stop for 3 days. It started as a whisper, fine flakes sifting down from a sky gone the color of old pewter, dusting the fence rails and the barn roof with a delicate white that almost looked peaceful. By noon, it was a wall. By evening, it was a siege. The wind came off the mountains at 40 miles an hour, driving the snow horizontal, packing it against every surface, filling the air so thick that Clara could not see the barn from the kitchen window. Wyatt was on the range when it hit. He and Hank and Tomas and Red Horse were running cattle down from the north pasture, trying to get the last of the herd into the sheltered draw before the storm closed the passes. They had been racing the weather all week, and the weather won. Wyatt's horse went down on a frozen creek. The animal hit a patch of ice under 6 inches of snow, and its legs went out from under it like someone had cut the strings. Wyatt came off hard, his left shoulder taking the impact against a rock. The pain was instant and absolute, dislocated. He could feel the joint wrong, the bone sitting where it should not be, the whole arm hanging useless. He got to his feet, caught the horse, walked it to the nearest fence post, put his shoulder against the wood, and shoved. The sound he made when the joint popped back was not a sound any of the other men mentioned afterward. Some things you give a man the courtesy of not remembering. He remounted and kept working. They saved most of the herd, lost 3 calves to the cold and 1 old cow who lay down in a drift and did not get up again. By the time they got the rest into the draw, the storm was so bad that Hank had to tie a rope between himself and Wyatt to keep from losing each other in the white. At the ranch, Clara had done what needed doing without being asked. She had brought the chickens into the mudroom, banked the fire so high the stovepipe glowed cherry red, filled every pot and bucket with water in case the pump froze, dragged extra firewood onto the porch, checked Nora's room for drafts, and stuffed rags into every crack she could find. When Wyatt came through the door at dark, crusted with ice and swaying on his feet, Clara had hot coffee and venison stew waiting. He sat at the table and tried to lift the cup with his left hand and could not. The shoulder was swelling bad, turning colors she did not like. "Let me see that," she said. He started to protest. "I did not ask," she said. She was finding that Wyatt Holloway responded better to statements than requests. She cleaned the shoulder, packed it with snow wrapped in cloth to bring the swelling down, bound it tight against his chest with strips torn from an old sheet. Her hands were steady. Her ribs screamed every time she reached across his body. She ignored them. While she worked, their faces were very close. Close enough that she could see the individual crystals of ice melting in his eyebrows. Close enough to smell the cold on him, and under it the scent of horse and leather and pine smoke. Close enough that when she tied the last strip of bandage, her fingers brushed the bare skin of his neck, and both of them went absolutely still. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Her fingertips on the pulse point below his jaw, his skin warm despite the cold, his heartbeat steady and strong under her touch. Neither moved, neither breathed. Then Nora appeared in the doorway, dragging a blanket and clutching Ghost, and the moment broke. The storm pinned them in the cabin for 3 days. Wyatt, Clara, Nora, Hank, and Ghost, 5 souls in 4 rooms with the wind screaming murder outside, and the fire the only barrier between them and a death that was patient and thorough, and would wait as long as it needed. Those 3 days changed everything. On the first night, Clara told Nora a story. An old Irish fairy tale her mother had told her in the apartment above the butcher shop, back when her mother was still alive and the world was still a place where beautiful things could happen. The story of a selkie, a creature who was a seal in the water, and a woman on land who could choose which world to live in. The selkie fell in love with a fisherman and shed her seal's skin to be with him. But she hid the skin in a secret place because she knew that one day she might need to go back to the sea. Nora listened with eyes like moons. When the story ended, she picked up her charcoal and began to draw. Not the woman walking away, not the wolf dog. Something new. A creature that was half seal and half woman, standing on a shore between two worlds, with a smile on its face that said, choosing was not the same as losing. Clara looked at the drawing and understood something about this child that she had not understood before. Nora was not silenced by inability. She had chosen a different language because the one she was born with had failed her. Words had failed her. Her mother had said, "I love you," and then left. Her father had said, "Everything will be all right," and nothing was. Words were liars. Images were truth. On the second night, the storm hit its peak. The walls shook. Snow drove through gaps so fine they should have been airtight. The temperature inside the cabin dropped despite the fire. Hank and Nora slept in the front room, bundled together with Ghost between them. The old man and the child sharing warmth in the way people had survived Montana winters since before anyone put it on a map. Wyatt and Clara sat by the fire, and for the first time they talked, really talked. Not the careful, edited versions they had shared before, not the fragments. The real thing. Wyatt told her about the village, not in order. Trauma does not organize itself into neat narrative. He told her in pieces, the order from the colonel, the argument he lost, the torches, the screaming, the door that collapsed on his arm, the child he saw running into the smoke, the silence afterward that was worse than the screaming because it meant there was no one left to scream. "I do not know how many died," he said. "I stopped counting because counting made them real, and I could not carry that number and keep living." He told her about Amelia, how she had tried. 3 years of trying. 3 years of waking to his screaming, of living with a man who flinched at sudden sounds and kept a loaded gun under his pillow and sometimes looked at her without seeing her at all. His eyes somewhere far away in a burning village that only he could visit. "She told me I was like living with a ghost," Wyatt said. That the real Wyatt Holloway had died in that village and what came home was just the shell, walking around, doing the motions, but empty inside. She was not wrong. Clara told him about the knife, the full story this time. 11 minutes standing over Garrett's bed with a 6-inch blade counting the ticks of the clock, adding up the years of pain against the seconds of courage she could not quite find. But she also told him something she had not told anyone. That the worst part was not the fear. The worst part was that after she put the knife down and went back to her side of the bed, she felt ashamed. Not of wanting to kill him, of not being brave enough to do it. Brave. "I thought there was something wrong with me," she said. "Something broken so deep it could not be fixed. A woman who could not even save herself." Wyatt looked at her across the firelight. His eyes, those pale gray eyes that had seemed so empty at the train station, were not empty now. They were full of something she did not have a name for. "You saved yourself," he said. "You are here. You are alive. That took more courage than any knife." "And you saved whatever you saved that night," Clara said. "In the village, even if you do not remember it. I believe you tried. I do not remember trying. Hank does. Maybe someday you will ask him." The fire popped. An ember landed on the hearthstones and glowed there, fading from orange to red to black. Clara stood to go to her room. At the door she paused. Wyatt. His name in her mouth felt like something she was testing, tasting, deciding whether it was safe. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me stay. Thank you for wanting to." It was not a love scene. There was no kiss, no embrace, no declaration. It was two people sitting on opposite sides of a fire in a cabin in a blizzard in Montana Territory in 1886, telling each other the worst things they had ever done, and finding that the worst things did not make them monsters. Just human. Just broken. Just alive. On the third morning, the storm broke. The sky cleared to a blue so pure it hurt to look at. The world was white and silent, and utterly transformed. Wyatt rode out to check the cattle. What he found turned his face to stone. 15 head dead, not from the storm. The pasture gate had been opened during the night, the cattle driven or lured out of the sheltered draw into the exposed flat where the wind had killed them. Frozen where they stood, some still upright, coated in ice, monuments to the kind of cruelty that used weather as a weapon. Hank found boot prints in the snow, half buried but still readable. The prints led south, toward the creek, toward the property line, toward Thornwood. Clara did not believe in ghosts, but the woman she glimpsed on the second floor of Thornwood looked very much like one. Or a prisoner. The loss of 15 cattle was more than a setback. For a ranch the size of Broken Ridge, operating on margins thin as paper, it was a blow that could bleed them dry. Each animal was worth $30 to $40. 15 head was close to $500 gone, enough to cover feed for the entire herd through winter, enough to mean the difference between surviving until spring and losing everything. Wyatt wanted to ride to Thornwood and confront Eli directly. Hank talked him down. "You have boot prints in snow that is melting. You have dead cattle that could have died from the storm. You have no witness and no proof. You ride to Thornwood angry, and Eli will have you arrested for trespassing and threatening behavior. And then who takes care of your ranch and your daughter?" Wyatt hated it because Hank was right. Sheriff Tom Dawkins, when informed, was the picture of careful uselessness. "Boot prints do not prove anything," he said, not meeting Wyatt's eyes. "Could have been anyone. Drifter, Indian, even one of your own hands. I will look into it." He would not look into it. Everyone knew that. Tom Dawkins owed Eli Thorne money and favors, in quantities that made him less a lawman and more a paid employee. Eli had helped Dawkins get elected. Eli had loaned him money for his house. Eli owned Tom Dawkins the way he owned cattle, fully and without apology. Clara decided to find her own answers. She rode to Copper Bend alone over Wyatt's objections, on the steadiest horse in the string, a dun mare named Penny, who had the temperament of a church pew. Wyatt did not like it. Clara did not ask him to like it. In town, she did what she did best. She listened. She asked small questions that opened big doors. She sat in Ruth Pratt's general store and helped sort buttons and let Ruth talk, because Ruth Pratt was the kind of woman who could not abide silence the way some people could not abide spiders. From Ruth, she learned that Amelia Holloway had left 4 years ago. No one in town had seen her board a train. No one had received a letter from her dated from anywhere else. From the blacksmith's wife, she learned that Eli Thorne had hired a housekeeper around the same time Amelia disappeared. A woman no one had seen clearly. She did not come to town. She did not attend church. She was a rumor more than a person. From the preacher's wife, she learned that sometimes, riding past Thornwood late at night, you could see lamplight on the second floor. And once, only once, the preacher's wife had heard crying. Like a woman, she said, or a ghost. Clara assembled these fragments the way she had once assembled the household accounts at the Aldridge estate back in Boston. Column by column, fact by fact, what added up and what did not. Amelia had not been seen leaving. A woman had appeared at Thornwood at the same time. No one had heard from Amelia since. The letters Clara had found in the anonymous threats were written on Thornwood stationery. And Amelia's letters to Wyatt had been returned unopened. meaning Amelia had stopped writing, or someone had stopped her from writing. The sum was ugly. Clara did something reckless. She took the empty apple basket from Eli's gift, the one that had been sitting in the kitchen for weeks, and she rode to Thornwood to return it. The stone house was larger up close than it appeared from across the valley. 2 stories of cut granite, hauled from a quarry 20 miles away. Broad porch with turned columns. Glass windows, real glass, not the oiled paper that served most frontier homes. A house built to impress, built to last, built by a man who believed that if you made something strong enough, nothing could take it from you. Eli met her on the porch with his usual grace. He took the basket. He offered tea. He led her into a parlor filled with fine furniture, oil paintings, a bookshelf holding more volumes than the Copper Bend schoolhouse. Everything was expensive. Everything was cold. The house felt like a museum, Clara thought, a place where things were preserved, not lived in. While Eli poured tea from a china pot that had no business being in Montana territory, Clara looked up at the ceiling and, through the corner of her eye, at the staircase. There, on the 2nd floor landing, through a door left barely ajar. A hand. A woman's hand, thin and pale as bone, reaching out to pull a curtain aside, and then releasing it. The curtain fell back. The hand disappeared. The door closed. Clara turned to Eli with her face perfectly composed. She had learned composure from Garrett. 3 years of hiding fear behind a smile had made her an expert in the performance of calm. "It must be lonely," she said, "living alone in a house this big." Eli's eyes sharpened for one instant, the briefest contraction, like a hawk spotting motion in the grass. Then the charm returned. "You get used to it. After Catherine and Daniel, I suppose I lost my taste for company." She heard the real pain in his voice. Eli Thorne was not performing grief. He had genuinely suffered. His wife and son, dead of diphtheria, 11 days of watching them fade. That was real, that was true. But suffering did not excuse what he had become. Clara finished her tea, made her excuses, rode toward home, and on the trail, a mile from Thornwood, 2 riders blocked her path. They were Eli's men, ranch hands with hard faces and new revolvers on their hips. The one who spoke had a scar on his chin and eyes that looked through her rather than at her. "Mrs. Thorne sends a message. Do not come back to Thornwood." Clara's hands tightened on the reins. She kept her voice level. "Mrs. Thorne, I thought Mr. Thorne lived alone." The 2 men looked at each other. The one with the scar realized what he had said, and his face closed like a slammed door. They wheeled their horses and rode back toward Thornwood at a gallop, leaving Clara alone on the trail with the taste of confirmation in her mouth. Mrs. Thorne. There was a woman at Thornwood. A woman who bore Eli's name, which meant either a marriage or a claim of ownership that amounted to the same thing. And that woman was almost certainly Amelia Holloway. Back at Broken Ridge, Clara found Wyatt in the corral teaching Nora to ride. The child sat on a small paint horse, her hands clutching the saddle horn, her face alive with a joy so fierce it transformed her. Ghost sat by the fence, watching with the proprietary concern of a guardian who did not entirely approve but was willing to tolerate. When Nora saw Clara riding in, she did something she had never done before. She lifted one hand from the saddle horn and waved. A small wave, a normal wave, the kind of gesture any 6-year-old might make without thinking. But for Nora, who had retreated so far into silence that even her body had stopped speaking, it was a revolution. Clara waved back and felt her heart break open a little wider. She had to tell Wyatt what she had found at Thornwood. She knew that. The woman upstairs, the slip about Mrs. Thorne, Doc Joe's memory of a frightened Amelia 2 weeks before she disappeared. All of it pointed to something monstrous, and Wyatt had a right to know. But telling him would shatter the fragile peace they had built. The quiet mornings, the coffee outside doors, the careful dance of 2 people learning that proximity did not have to mean pain. If she told him his ex-wife had been imprisoned across the creek for 4 years while his daughter grew up silent and motherless, the man she was beginning to know, the man who carried Nora through snowstorms and left medicine without expecting thanks, that man might disappear. replaced by the soldier, the one who burned things. She chose silence. She told herself she needed more proof. She told herself she was protecting him. She was protecting herself, and she knew it, and she chose silence anyway. That was her first real mistake. Later that night, after supper, after Nora was in bed and the house was quiet, Eli Thorne sat in a room at Thornwood that he had not allowed anyone to enter in 5 years. It was a child's room. A small bed with a quilt stitched by a woman now dead. A wooden horse on the shelf, hand-carved with one ear chipped from rough play. Small boots by the door, still carrying the dust of the last day they were worn. A shelf of picture books, a tin of marbles. Everything exactly as Daniel had left it. Eli sat on the bed and spoke to the empty room. She is smart, that one. Smarter than Amelia. She will figure it out eventually. But by then it will not matter. Holloway cannot hold that ranch through winter. Not after losing those cattle. The land will come to me, and I will keep everyone safe. Everyone in their place. Everything where it belongs. The way I should have kept you safe. He touched the small pillow, closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids he heard his son's voice saying, "Daddy," the way Daniel always had, making the word sound like a prayer and a promise, and the whole of the world rolled into 2 syllables. This was not the scene of a villain. This was the scene of a man who had watched his world die and rebuilt it as a prison, because a prison was the only place he knew where nothing could leave. Wyatt Holloway had not killed anyone since leaving the army. Tonight, that record almost broke. It was past midnight when ghosts started growling. Not the low warning grumble the wolf dog used for coyotes and raccoons and other nuisances. This was something deeper, something that vibrated in the animal's chest like a struck chord. A sound that said threat, a sound that said now. Wyatt was out of bed with the Colt in his hand, before his eyes were fully open. 4 years of sleeping with the gun under his pillow had made the motion automatic, a reflex as natural as breathing and just as reliable. He did not put on boots, did not reach for a coat. He went through the front door barefoot in his union suit with the Colt raised and his eyes adjusting to the dark. The north fence was on fire. Orange light crawled along the fence rails, eating the dry wood in hungry gulps, throwing sparks into a sky already gray with smoke. Beyond the fence, cattle were running. He could hear them, the thunder of hooves and the bellowing panic of animals who understood fire the way all creatures did as the oldest enemy, the one that had been killing since before memory. 2 men on horseback were silhouetted against the flames. One was swinging a torch, spreading the fire to the next section of fence. The other was driving the cattle through the gap. Wyatt did not think. He moved. His gray gelding Jack was in the near corral. Wyatt vaulted the fence, grabbed a handful of mane, and swung up bareback. No saddle, no bridle, just the horse and the man, and the fury that had been building since the first dead cattle were found frozen in the snow. He kicked Jack into a gallop, and the horse responded the way a cavalry mount responds to a rider it trusts with everything it had. They tore through the smoke and the heat and the screaming cattle, and Wyatt saw the closer of the 2 arsonists turn in the saddle and raise something that was not a torch. The gunshot split the night. Wyatt felt the bullet pass through the meat of his left shoulder, missing bone by a margin. He would later measure at less than an inch. The impact spun him sideways, but he stayed on Jack's back through sheer reflex, the Colt still in his right hand, his left arm suddenly hot and wet and useless. He fired back. Not to kill. Into the ground, in front of the man's horse. The horse reared, and the man lost his torch and his nerve simultaneously. He wheeled and ran. The second man, the shooter, was not as quick. Wyatt closed the distance at a gallop, pulled alongside, and hit the man with a shoulder check that drove both of them off their horses and into the dirt. They went down hard. Wyatt landed on top, which was the only advantage he had because his left arm was not working and his feet were bare, and the pain in his shoulder was the kind that made the edges of the world go white. But he had his right hand and the Colt and a rage that had been building for longer than he cared to admit. He pressed the barrel against the man's forehead. The man was young, 20 maybe, blonde hair, wide eyes, mouth opening and closing like a fish dragged from water. A cowhand, not a gunfighter. Eli Thorne had sent boys to do a man's dirty work. Wyatt's finger was on the trigger. His hand was shaking, not from the wound, from something else. Something that was pulling him backward through years, back to the village, back to the fire, back to the moment when following orders had turned him into the kind of man who could not look in a mirror. He was going to shoot. He could feel it building the way a storm builds, pressure and heat and inevitability. One more second, one more breath. Hank's hand on his shoulder. "You are not that man anymore." 5 words, spoken quietly the way you speak to a horse that is about to bolt. No command, no judgment. Just truth, offered like an open hand. Wyatt lowered the Colt. The young man on the ground started crying. His name was Pete Garfield, and he had been hired at Thornwood 3 months ago. And he would talk. He would tell them everything. But first, Clara had to stitch Wyatt's shoulder back together. She did it at the kitchen table by lamplight. Hot water and clean rags and a needle she sterilized in whiskey flame. Wyatt sat shirtless in the chair, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping, his right hand flat on the table, his left arm hanging. The bullet had gone through clean. No bone, no major vessels. But the wound was ugly, a trough carved through muscle, and it needed stitching, and Clara's hands were shaking almost as badly as his. She poured whiskey into the wound, and he made a sound like tearing cloth. She threaded the needle and began to sew. Her face was inches from his skin. She could feel the heat radiating from him, could see the older scars that mapped his body like a history written in white. The burn on his forearm, a knife scar across his ribs, the puckered mark of an old bullet wound on his right side. This man had been hurt many times, and he had kept going. She understood that. She had a body full of scars, too, most of them invisible. While she stitched, she told him everything. The woman at Thornwood, the hand pulling the curtain, Mrs. Thorne, Doc Joe's story about Amelia being frightened 2 weeks before she left, the piece about the Thornwood stationery on the letters. She watched his face change as she spoke. Not anger at her for keeping secrets, though she deserved it. Anger at himself, the kind of anger that turns inward and eats. "Amelia," he said, 4 years. 4 years my daughter has not spoken because she thinks her mother abandoned her, and Amelia has been across the creek this whole time. Then he slammed his fist on the table so hard the whiskey bottle jumped. And then he sat. And then he said something Clara did not expect. Amelia was not kidnapped. She chose to go to Eli. She told me the night before she left that she could not live with a man who screamed every night, who slept with a loaded gun, who brought ghosts home from the war and let them walk the house. Clara set down the needle. But she left Nora. She wanted to take Nora. I would not let her. I said, that child is all I have left. If you go alone. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. And Nora stopped talking after that, Clara said. Because she heard everything. Heard her mother beg to take her. Heard me say no. Clara finished the stitching in silence. Tied the thread. Cut it. Bandaged the wound with strips of clean cotton. She did all of this with steady hands while her mind spun like a wheel on ice. Wyatt Holloway was not a villain, but he was not blameless either. He had kept his daughter not out of pure love, but out of the desperate need to hold on to the last thing he had. And that need had broken the child. Nora's silence was not just because her mother left. It was because her father chose to let it happen. Clara went to her room, sat on the bed, picked up the derringer and held it in her lap the way a woman holds a rosary, not for use, but for comfort. This is when you leave, the voice in her head said, the voice that had been trained by Garrett to recognize the precise moment when a situation becomes unsalvageable. This is when any sane person would leave. He lied by omission. He caused his daughter's suffering. He is another broken man who will break you if you stay. She was reaching for her carpet bag when she heard a sound outside her door. She opened it. Nora stood there in her nightgown, bare feet on the cold floor, ghost pressed against her legs. The child was not crying. She was not making any sound at all. She just looked up at Clara with her father's gray eyes, and an expression that Clara recognized in her bones, because it was the expression she had worn at 6 years old, every morning when her mother left for the Aldrich house, and Clara was terrified that this would be the time she did not come back. "Please do not leave me." That was what the eyes said. The mouth did not move, but the eyes were screaming. Clara knelt down and pulled Nora into her arms. The child gripped her so hard that Clara's cracked ribs sang with pain, and she did not care. She did not care about anything except this small body in her arms, this fierce and silent girl who had chosen her on a platform in Copper Bend and was choosing her again now in a dark hallway in Montana. She carried Nora back to bed, tucked her in, sat beside her until the child fell asleep with Ghost curled at her feet, and Clara's hand resting on her hair. She was not staying for Wyatt. She was staying for this child who needed her. And if that meant staying with a man whose mistakes had caused the very pain she was trying to heal, then so be it. She had survived worse complications. By morning, Pete Garfield had talked. Sitting in Sheriff Dawkins' office with snot on his lip and terror in his eyes, the young cowhand had confessed everything. Eli Thorne had paid him $50 to torch the fence and scatter the cattle. Eli wanted Broken Ridge weakened, wanted Wyatt unable to make it through winter, wanted the land. But Pete said something else, too, something that made Dawkins put down his coffee and Wyatt's hands curl into fists. "There is a woman at Thornwood," Pete said. "She is not allowed out. She cries at night. I heard her through the floor when I was bunking in the hands' quarters." Sheriff Dawkins looked at Wyatt, looked at the wall, looked at his own hands. For the first time in his small, indebted life, Tom Dawkins had to choose between the man who owned him and the oath he had sworn. Wyatt Holloway rode to Thornwood not as an ex-husband, not as a neighbor. He rode as a father who had made the worst mistake of his life and was riding to face what it cost. The morning was cold and clear, the sky washed clean by the storm that had passed, the mountains standing in sharp relief against a blue so deep it looked painted. Wyatt rode his gray gelding Jack with Hank on his right and Sheriff Dawkins behind, the lawman looking like a man on his way to his own hanging. Clara stayed at the ranch with Nora. Wyatt had asked her to. She had agreed, not because she was obedient, but because someone needed to be with the child if this went wrong. And things could go wrong in a dozen different ways, most of them ending with gunfire. Thornwood's stone house stood in the morning light like a fortress, which was what Eli Thorne had designed it to be. A place nothing could escape from, a place nothing could penetrate, a monument to a man's belief that if you built walls thick enough, the world could not reach in and take anything else from you. Eli met them on the porch. He was dressed impeccably, as always. Dark coat, clean shirt, polished boots. His smile was in place, though Clara would have noticed it did not reach his eyes. He had 6 ranch hands positioned in the yard and on the bunkhouse porch, casual but watchful, their gun belts prominent. "What brings you out, Holloway?" Eli said. "I believe we settled our fence dispute already." "Amelia," Wyatt said. "I am here for Amelia." The smile on Eli Thorne's face did something complicated. It did not disappear. It changed, like a mask shifting to reveal a different mask underneath. "Amelia is here of her own free will," Eli said. "Then let her say that herself, in front of the sheriff." Eli looked at Wyatt for a long time, looked at Dawkins, who was sweating despite the cold, looked at Hank, who sat his horse with the Winchester across his saddle and an expression that suggested he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "Fine," Eli said, "but you come inside alone and you leave the gun." The silence that followed lasted 3 heartbeats. Wyatt's hand rested on the butt of the Colt. the weapon that had lived on his hip for a decade, the one he slept with under his pillow, the one constant in a life where everything else had been taken or broken or burned. He unbuckled the gun belt and handed it to Hank. Hank took it without a word. Their eyes met. Something passed between them that did not need language. Then Wyatt turned and walked up the porch steps and through the front door of Thornwood unarmed. Hank watched him go. Then, moving with the quiet deliberation of a man who had survived slavery and war and every cruelty the century had to offer, he dismounted, took his Winchester, and circled to the side of the house where a window gave him a line of sight into the parlor. Inside, Clara would learn later, the confrontation was short. Wyatt stood in Eli's parlor, surrounded by expensive furniture and oil paintings, and the accumulated possessions of a man who believed that owning enough things could fill the space where a family used to be. Eli stood across from him, hands at his sides, the smile finally gone, replaced by something raw and honest and terrible. "Bring her down," Wyatt said. Eli said nothing. He walked to the stairs, climbed them, opened a door on the second floor, and a woman descended. Amelia Holloway was 30 years old, but she looked older, thin in a way that spoke of meals missed by choice or force, pale from 4 years of limited sunlight. Her hair, which Wyatt remembered as brown and bright, was dull and streaked with early gray. Her eyes were the eyes of a woman who had been looking at the same 4 walls for so long that the concept of open space had become theoretical. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Wyatt, and there was no love in her face. No hatred either, just exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of a woman who had stopped hoping so long ago that she had forgotten what it felt like. "I came here willingly," Amelia said. Her voice was rusty, like a hinge that had not been used. "At first, Eli promised to help me get to San Francisco. He was kind. Then the doors started locking. My letters stopped arriving. I became a thing, something he owned." Eli's mask shattered. "I lost Catherine," he said, and his voice broke like a dry branch. "I lost Daniel. I sat in that room and watched them die for 11 days, and I could not stop it. I could not stop any of it. I could not lose another person. I just wanted someone to stay." Sheriff Dawkins stepped forward. He was pale and sweating, and his hand was shaking, but he stepped forward. "Eli Thorne," he said, "I am placing you under arrest on charges of unlawful imprisonment. You will be held at the county jail in Copper Bend and stand before Judge Harlan at the territorial court." Eli did not fight, did not run. He sat down on his own porch steps and wept, and the sound he made was not the sound of a villain being brought to justice. It was the sound of a man who had finally lost the last thing he was holding on to, which was the illusion that what he was doing was love. They took him to the county jail. Dawkins locked the cell, and Eli Thorne sat on the narrow cot in the narrow room and stared at the narrow walls, and for the first time in 5 years was inside a cage instead of building one. Back at Thornwood, Wyatt faced Amelia alone. The conversation he had owed for 4 years. The hardest words he had ever spoken, and he had spoken orders to burn. "I was wrong," he said. "I was wrong to keep Nora from you." Amelia looked at him. "I was wrong to leave without fighting for her. Nora does not speak anymore, since the day you left." Amelia's hand went to her mouth. Her eyes filled. The sound she made was small and sharp and contained all the grief of a mother who had missed 4 years of her child's life and now learned that those years had been spent in silence. They did not reconcile, did not embrace, did not pretend that what was broken between them could be unbroken. But they stood in the ruins of their shared failure and acknowledged it, which was the first step towards something that might eventually look like healing. Wyatt brought Amelia to Broken Ridge. She sat in the back of the wagon, wrapped in a blanket, looking at the land she had left 4 years ago as if seeing it for the first time. When they pulled up to the cabin, Clara was standing on the porch with Nora, and Amelia's eyes locked on her daughter and did not leave. Clara saw them coming, saw Amelia, and her internal flaw, the one she had been fighting since Boston, the one that whispered, "You are not enough. You are a placeholder. You will always be the one who gets left." detonated like a charge of black powder in her chest. He brought her back, his wife, Nora's mother, the woman these rooms were stripped bare for. And Clara was what? The hired help? The mail-order bride who never got married? The warm body filling a space until the real thing returned? She did not almost leave. She left. She packed her carpet bag with the few things she owned. She took the morning supply wagon when Hank drove it to town. She sat in the Copper Bend train station on a wooden bench worn smooth by 1,000 departures and bought a ticket to Portland. $14, everything she had saved from her wages. A one-way ticket to a city where she knew no one and had nothing, and would start again from zero because starting from zero was something she knew how to do. It was staying that terrified her. Staying meant trusting. Trusting meant needing. And needing was the door through which every terrible thing in her life had entered. The train arrived at 11:14. It steamed and hissed, and the conductor called all aboard for Billings, Spokane, and Portland. And the doors opened, and passengers climbed on. Clara sat on the bench, ticket in her hand, carpet bag at her feet. The whistle blew. She did not move. The conductor looked at her. "Ma'am, this train." She looked at the ticket, looked at the train, looked at the mountains visible above the station roof, white and enormous and ancient, and completely indifferent to whether she stayed or went. She thought about Nora's hand in hers, about Wyatt's coffee outside her door, about the way the firelight looked on the faces of people who had told each other the worst and survived it, about a small girl who had chosen her on a platform, and a man who had said, "I want you to stay," with more honesty than anyone had ever offered her in her life. She was afraid. She was so afraid it felt like her bones were dissolving. Because if she went back and it failed, if she trusted and was betrayed, if she opened herself up and was broken again, she would not survive it. Not a third time. Not after Garrett and the knife and the 11 minutes and the long gray years of believing she was worth nothing. But she also knew that if she got on that train, she would survive. She would make it to Portland. She would find work. She would build another wall around another life, and it would be safe and small and empty. And she would die inside it, having never known whether Broken Ridge could have been home. The train began to move. Clara stayed on the bench. She was still sitting there when the train disappeared around the bend and the station went quiet. And the station master gave her a look that said, "Lady, are you all right?" And she stood up and said, "I need to get back to the ranch. Is there a wagon heading south?" She walked back to Broken Ridge. 5 miles. The same distance she and Wyatt had walked in the dark after the broken axle. But this time she walked alone, and every step was a choice. And by the time she saw the cabin roof above the ridge, she was not the same woman who had left it. She had chosen, not because someone needed her, because she needed them. And for a woman who had been beaten for needing, punished for wanting, taught that need was weakness and desire was danger, admitting that she needed these people was the bravest act of her life. Braver than the knife. Braver than Boston. Braver than anything. She walked up the porch steps, opened the door. Wyatt was standing in the front room, hat in his hands, his face carrying an expression she had never seen on him. Fear. Not the old kind. Not the war kind. The new kind. The kind that comes from realizing you might lose something you did not know you had until it walked out the door. "Clara," he started. She held up her hand. "Amelia needs to see Nora. That is what matters right now. We will talk later." The meeting between Amelia and Nora happened in the front room with the late afternoon light coming through the windows, and Ghost sitting watchful beside the child. Clara and Wyatt stood by the door, close enough to intervene but far enough to give space. Amelia knelt on the plank floor. Tears ran down her face, but her voice was steady. She had been rehearsing this for 4 years. "I am sorry," she said. "Baby, I am so sorry. Mama made a terrible mistake. Mama left when she should have stayed and fought. I am sorry. Nora looked at her mother, the woman from all those drawings. The woman seen from behind, always walking away, never with a face. Now here, now real, now kneeling on the floor with tears and apologies, and a face that Nora had tried to forget and failed. The child looked at Amelia, looked at Clara, looked at Wyatt. Then Nora opened her mouth and spoke her first words in 4 years. Not to her mother, turning to Clara. Do not go. 2 words, spoken in a voice that was rusty and small and completely clear. A voice that had been silent for 1,460 days and had chosen this moment, this person, this request to break its long fast. Do not go. Clara dropped to her knees, pulled Nora against her, held the child while Wyatt stood in the doorway with tears running down his face, and Amelia knelt on the floor with her hands over her mouth and Ghost pressed against all of them, whimpering, because even the wolf dog understood that something had just cracked open that could not be closed again. They said the winter of 1886 killed half the cattle in Montana Territory. They were wrong. It killed more. January 1887 came in like a beast and did not leave for 3 months. Blizzard after blizzard. Temperature falling to 40 below zero. Snow so deep it buried fence posts and drifted over barn roofs and turned the world into a white, featureless expanse that offered no landmark and no mercy. This was real history. The ranchers called it the Great Die-Up, and when it was over, the open-range cattle industry that had built Montana was destroyed. Men who had been millionaires in November were bankrupt by March. Herds that numbered in the thousands were reduced to hundreds, then dozens, then bones in the spring mud. Broken Ridge was not spared. Wyatt lost more than half his herd. 180 cattle out of 300 frozen or starved or suffocated in drift so deep the animals could not move. He found them in the spring, when the snow melted, standing upright in death like monuments to a suffering that had no witness except the wind. He rode out in every storm, trying to save what he could, heroic and futile. The land did not care about courage. It did not care about need or love or desperation. It simply killed, patiently and thoroughly, anything that was not strong enough or lucky enough to survive. He nearly died in the 3rd week of January. 2 miles from the house, in a whiteout so complete he could not see his horse's ears, the cold reached a depth where the body stops shivering and starts giving up. Hank and Tomas found him slumped over Jack's neck, blue-lipped and barely conscious, the horse standing stock still in the storm, because the animal had more sense than the man, and had stopped walking to keep from going over a cliff neither of them could see. They dragged him inside, put him by the fire. Clara stripped off his frozen clothes and wrapped herself around him, sharing body heat in the most literal and least romantic way possible. Her cracked ribs pressed against his frozen chest, her arms around a body that shook so violently his teeth cracked. That night she thought he might die, not from the cold, from what came after. The depression settled over Wyatt like a second winter, one that happened inside instead of out. He sat on the porch staring at the white expanse of dead land and did not speak, did not eat, did not move. Clara carried everything. She fed Nora. She managed the dwindling supplies, stretching every sack of flour and every tin of beans until the numbers on her careful inventory sheet became acts of defiance against arithmetic. She found Red Horse in the bunkhouse and asked him to teach her what he knew. The Crowman looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. "Your people have been here 30 years, he said. My people, 300 generations. The land speaks. You just have to learn its language." He taught her to read the snow for places where grass survived underneath, marked by the digging of elk. He taught her to build windbreaks from fallen timber that could shelter a dozen head from the killing wind. He taught her to read the sky for the breaks between storms that lasted sometimes only hours, but were enough to move cattle to better ground. Clara learned because learning was surviving, and surviving was the only thing she had ever been good at. Nora saved her father. Not Clara, not Hank, not the slow return of spring or the gradual climbing of the temperature or any of the external forces that were turning the tide. Nora. The child walked to where Wyatt sat on the porch, his eyes seeing nothing, his hands limp in his lap. She climbed up beside him. She put a drawing on his knee. It was not a woman walking away. It was not the wolf dog or the dark scribbles of fear or the empty white spaces of silence. It was something new. 3 figures standing in front of a house, a tall man, a woman with dark hair, a small girl. Above them, a sun. In the yard, flowers. Beside them, a wolf dog with yellow eyes. It was the first drawing Nora had ever made of a family staying together. Not leaving. Staying. Wyatt looked at the drawing, looked at his daughter, looked at the drawing again. And somewhere behind his eyes, something shifted. The depression did not lift. It does not work that way. But something broke through it. A crack in the ice. A sign that the river underneath was still moving. He put his arm around Nora and held her, and the child pressed against him, and they sat like that for a long time while the sun, weak and thin and persistent, worked at the snow. Clara came outside with a piece of paper covered in numbers. She sat down on the porch steps and laid out the math. We lost 180 head. We have 70 left. If we sell 20 in early spring at premium prices, because everyone lost cattle and prices will be double at least, we have enough money to feed the remaining 50 through next winter. In 2 years, the herd rebuilds to 100. 3 years, and we are back to where we started. Wyatt looked at the paper, looked at Clara. 3 years, he said. 3 years. But we will be alive. You really believe we can survive this? I survived 3 years with Garrett Byrne. I survived Boston alone. I came to Montana with cracked ribs and $4. This winter is not worse than what I have already lived through. Wyatt took the paper, studied the numbers, nodded, stood up. For the first time in weeks, he stood up. That evening, after Nora was asleep, after the fire was banked and the house was warm, and the first stars were appearing through windows now hung with simple curtains Clara had sewn from flour sacking, because even in the worst winter she could not abide a bare window, Wyatt turned to Clara. "When this is over," he said, "when spring comes, I want to marry you. Not a work arrangement, not for Nora's sake, for mine. Because you are the strongest person I have ever known, and I want to spend whatever time I have got left standing next to that." Clara looked at him. This man with his scars and his guilt and his dead cattle and his broken fences and his beautiful silent daughter and his wolf dog and his grief. This man who had rejected her before she arrived and then spent every day since trying to keep her. This man who was not good with words but meant every single one he said. "Ask me again when the snow melts," she said. "I want to say yes on a day when I can see the sun." They married on the first day of spring, when the ground was just soft enough to plant flowers and just warm enough to believe that winter was truly done. But first, there was a death. The news came 3 days before the wedding. Eli Thorne had hanged himself in the county jail in Copper Bend. He had used his own belt, knotted to the crossbar of the cell window. The deputy found him at dawn, still warm, a folded paper on the cot beside him. The paper was his will, handwritten, witnessed by Father Ruiz, who had visited him every week and who was the last person to speak with him alive. The will left everything: Thornwood, the land, the livestock, the stone house, and all its contents, divided equally between Amelia Holloway and Wyatt Holloway. At the bottom, in a hand that shook, a final line: "I only wanted to not be alone. I am sorry." Clara went to the jail. She did not know why. She had no affection for Eli Thorne and no obligation to the dead. But something pulled her there. Some need to see the end of a story that had begun with a hand at a window and letters in red ink. She stood in the cell, looked at the narrow cot and the narrow walls and the belt mark on the crossbar. She thought about Garrett, about Eli, about the way pain, when it is not treated, when it is not shared, when it is locked inside and allowed to grow in the dark, becomes something that devours. First the person who carries it, then everyone they touch. Eli Thorne had not been born a monster. He had been made into one by 11 days in a sick room watching his wife and son die. And then he had spent 5 years building a world where no one could ever leave him again, not understanding that a world without exits is not a home. It is a grave. Clara had almost been Amelia. She had almost let a broken man's need become her cage, twice. Once with Garrett, who used fists, and nearly again if she had not been strong enough to recognize what was happening and walk away. She left the jail and walked back into the spring sunlight and took a breath of air that smelled like mud and snowmelt and new grass and the particular sweetness that earth gives off when it wakes up after a long sleep. 3 days later, she married Wyatt Holloway. The small church in Copper Bend was built of white-painted wood with a steeple that leaned slightly to the east, as if the wind had been pushing it for so long that it had learned to accommodate. Father Mateo Ruiz officiated, his voice carrying the warmth and gravity of a man who had performed this ceremony many times and still believed in it every time. The whole town came. Ruth and Samuel Pratt from the general store. Doc Joe Ridley in a dress for once, with her flask visible in her coat pocket. Mrs. Doyle from the post office, crying openly. Sheriff Dawkins looking relieved that something good was happening for once. Thomas Guerrero in a clean shirt with his hair slicked back. Red Horse standing at the back of the church, his face giving away nothing except, if you looked very closely, something that might have been satisfaction. Clara wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton that she and Doc Joe had sewn together over 3 evenings of whiskey and straight pins, and language that would have made Father Ruiz cover his ears. It was the first time in Clara's life she had worn anything but black or gray. The color of it, the lightness of it, felt like a statement, like a flag planted on new ground. Nora carried wildflowers. She had picked them herself that morning from the south meadow where the snow had melted first, and she held them in both hands with the fierce concentration of a child who understood that this moment mattered. Hank walked Clara down the aisle. He wore his one good coat, the one he kept for funerals and weddings and the rare occasions when dignity demanded something beyond work clothes. He walked with the measured pace of a man who had once been denied the right to walk where he pleased, and who now chose every step with deliberate care. No long speeches, no poetry. Just 2 people standing before a man of God in a crooked church in a small town in Montana Territory in 1887, saying the words that meant they were choosing each other, choosing to stay. Father Ruiz said, "Wyatt, do you take Clara?" Wyatt said, "Since the day she stepped off that train." Father Ruiz said, "Clara, do you take Wyatt?" Clara said, "Since the moment he said you are coming with me." Full circle. The words that had begun everything spoken now as a promise instead of a command. After the wedding, there were things to resolve, threads to tie, truths to tell. Amelia had left for San Francisco 2 weeks before the ceremony. She had stayed at Broken Ridge long enough to begin the slow, painful work of rebuilding a relationship with her daughter. Nora was speaking now. Not much. Not easily. Words came from her the way water comes from a deep well, slowly and with effort. But they came, and some of them were addressed to Amelia. Amelia did not ask to stay, did not ask for Wyatt back, did not pretend that the years in Eli's house had not happened. She was honest about what she wanted. San Francisco, independence, a life she built herself, and letters, regular letters to and from a daughter who was learning to forgive. Nora replied to those letters with drawings, and with words, a few at a time, written in the careful hand Clara was teaching her, sentences that grew longer month by month like a garden coming back after winter. It was enough. Not perfect. Not the fairy tale resolution that pretends all wounds can be healed by the right words at the right time. But it was enough, and in a world as hard as this one, enough was its own kind of miracle. There was one more truth. It was Hank who told Clara, because Hank had carried it long enough. They were in the barn, a week after the wedding, repairing a stall that had been damaged by the winter storms. Hank was working with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been fixing things his whole life, and Clara was holding boards while he nailed, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind. "There is something you should know about the village," Hank said. Clara set down the board. She had been waiting for this. She did not know what for, but she had been waiting. Wyatt believes he only destroyed that night, that all he did was follow orders and burn. But that is not the whole of it. His mind broke during the fire, and the pieces did not come back together right. He lost parts of the story. The worst parts, yes, but also the parts that might have saved him. What parts? There was a back way out of the village, a gap between two buildings. Wyatt found it. He opened it. He pulled people through. 12 that I counted. Women, children, an old man who could not walk, and Wyatt carried on his back. Clara's breath stopped. "The burn on his arm," Hank continued. "He did not get that from a beam falling on him. He got it pulling a burning door frame off a woman who was trapped underneath. He saved her baby. Then the roof came down, and the smoke got too thick, and he could not get back inside, and the screaming started and did not stop, and his mind broke. Why did you not tell him? Because the truth has to come at the right time. Tell a man too early and he cannot hear it. Tell him too late and it does not matter. You know him better than anyone now. You will know when he is ready." Clara told Wyatt that evening on the porch in the last of the daylight. She told him quietly, "The way you tell someone something that might change everything, with care and precision and the willingness to catch them if they fall." Wyatt did not believe it. Clara said, "Ask Hank." Wyatt found Hank in the barn. The old man was waiting. He had been waiting for years. He told Wyatt everything. Who came out? How many? The woman with the baby. The old man Wyatt carried. The children who ran through the gap he had opened while the fire ate the rest of the village behind them. 12 lives saved by a man who thought he had only destroyed. The burn scar, Hank said. That is not from destruction. That is from pulling a door frame off a woman and her child. You saved them, Wyatt. You saved 12 people that night. Your mind broke and you lost the memory, but the saving happened. I was there. I saw it. Wyatt sat on the porch steps and wept. Not the silent, clenched grief Clara had seen before. Real weeping. The kind that comes from the release of a weight carried so long it has become part of your skeleton. 10 years of believing he was a monster. 10 years of no mirrors. 10 years of sleeping with a gun because he did not trust himself to be safe without one. And now this. Not absolution. Not erasure of what happened, but a piece of the truth he had been missing, the piece that said you are not only what you destroyed, you are also what you saved. Clara sat beside him, put her hand on his back, waited. When the tears passed, Wyatt stood, went inside, came back with something he had bought in town the day before the wedding and had not yet found the courage to use. A mirror, small, wooden frame, plain as a fence post. He hung it on the wall by the front door. The first mirror in the house since Amelia left, since the village, since the long night of the soul that had lasted a decade. He looked at himself, the scar on his forearm, the lines around his eyes, the gray beginning to thread through his dark hair. A face that had been through fire and winter and grief and come out the other side looking exactly like what it was, the face of a man who had been broken and had chosen to keep going. Clara stood beside him. Her reflection appeared next to his. Brown eyes, dark hair, a face that carried its own map of survival, faded bruises and sleepless nights, and the particular set of a jaw that belongs to a woman who has decided she is done running. "Does not look so bad," Wyatt said. "Looks like a family," Clara said. Nora appeared behind them. Sleepy, nightgown trailing on the floor, Ghost padding beside her as always. "Why is everyone staring at the wall?" Nora said. They laughed, all 3 of them. And the sound of it filled the cabin, bouncing off the walls, filling the spaces where silence had lived for too long. The ranch survived. Spring brought exactly what Clara had calculated. Cattle prices surged because everyone had lost stock and the demand far outstripped what was left. They sold 20 head at double the normal rate. The inheritance from Eli's will gave them Thornwood's acreage, expanding their grazing land by a factor of 3. It would not happen overnight. Recovery would take the 3 years Clara had predicted, and those years would be full of the ordinary hardships that came with ranching in Montana Territory. Bad weather, sick cattle, markets that moved like weather, unpredictable and uncaring. But they would survive. They would more than survive. It was autumn again when the last scene of this story played out. 1 year from the day Clara had stepped off a train onto the platform at Copper Bend with cracked ribs and a bruised face and $4.12 in her purse. She stood on the same platform. The mountains wore their first cap of snow. The air smelled like wood smoke and dried grass, and the particular sharpness of an October day in Montana, when the light goes golden and the world looks like something you would paint if you could hold it still long enough. She was there to pick up a shipment of supplies, fence wire and flour, and a bolt of blue calico she had ordered for a dress she was making Nora for Christmas. Normal things. The ordinary commerce of a life that had become, against all probability, ordinary in the best possible way. The train pulled in. Passengers descended, cattlemen and drummers and a family with 3 small children and too much luggage. And then, last off the car, holding the handrail with the white-knuckled grip of someone who had not slept in days, a young woman. She was maybe 22, thin, wearing a dress that had once been nice but was now wrinkled and stained from days of travel. She carried a single carpet bag. Her right eye was bruised, a deep, ugly purple that extended down to her cheekbone. Her lip was split. She stood on the platform and looked around with an expression Clara knew the way she knew her own reflection. Terror. Exhaustion. The desperate, fragile hope of someone who has run as far as she can and has no idea what comes next. Clara did not hesitate, did not wait for introductions, did not ask for a story or an explanation or credentials. She walked across the platform the way Wyatt had walked across it a year ago, with purpose and certainty, and something that looked very much like recognition. "Are you all right?" Clara said. The young woman looked at her. Her split lip trembled, her eyes filled. "I am looking for," she started. "I know," Clara said. She took the woman's hand, the way Nora had taken hers, the way Wyatt had never had to because his words had done the reaching for him. Hand to hand. The oldest language, the most honest one. "Come with me," Clara said. The words Wyatt had spoken on this platform 1 year ago, standing in the wind with wilting flowers in his hand and recognition in his eyes. "You are coming with me, not a command, an invitation, a door opening instead of closing." They walked to the wagon where Wyatt was waiting, Nora beside him on the bench, Ghost lying in the wagon bed with his yellow eyes half closed. Wyatt saw the young woman's face, saw the bruises. His jaw tightened the way it had tightened a year ago. But he did not ask questions. He did not need to. He just shifted over on the bench to make room. Behind them, as the wagon rolled south toward Broken Ridge, the mountains stood in their autumn light. Granite and snow and timber, old beyond counting, marked by every storm and fire and season, but still standing, still there. And the ridge line that gave the ranch its name, that jagged, fractured spine of rock visible from the porch where Clara and Wyatt would sit that evening with coffee in their hands and their daughter between them and the wolf dog at their feet. That ridgeline rose against the sky exactly as it always had, still broken, still standing, after everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.